Hello from wherever you are, and thank you for joining the first Global Market Encounter of 2025 with Jimmy Fitzpatrick. Hello from wherever you are, and thank you for joining the first Global Market Encounter of 2025 with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in both French and English, and you can access your preferred language via the globe icon at the bottom left side of your screen. The webinar is also available live on the ACA Facebook page and YouTube channel. You can ask questions and leave comments in the discussion box below. We would like to appreciate our partners and sponsors, to mention the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and cashewinformation.com. To share a few announcements with you, the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo will take place from November 18th to 22nd of 2025 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania at the GNICC Convention Center. You can register now and enjoy 40% off all your conference rates. Also, this coming Friday, 7th of March 2025 from 9 a.m. GMT, ACA is inviting you to the Cashew Barometer Stakeholder Meeting to validate the new ACA Cashew Barometer app. Check our social media handles for the link. To dive into today's session, let me introduce to you our hosts. Jim Fitzpatrick is an award-winning consultant, a business coach, a cashew specialist. He's also known for his ability to forecast the market and see its challenges from a different perspective. He has experience and knowledge that have been gained over 30 years. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Stella. How are you?
I'm good. How are you too?
All good. All good. Just back from the World Cashew Conference. Back from the Mewa, India before that. Interesting times.
The floor is yours for today's session.
Thank you, Stella. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Wherever you are, you're very welcome to the first GME of 2025. Today, we're going to take a kind of a mixed approach. We're going to have a look at some of the market information topics and some of the reasons to be careful, particularly at this time of year. And of course, we're going to have a look at the market. We'll look at production and the outlook for production across the globe. We'll have a look at some of the big factors on demand and consumption. And there are big questions now. And we'll finish off with some of the outliers, some of the things that might happen, some of the things that could influence the market, and some of the big questions for 2025. So let's start with the first topic. I'm just calling it New Season, Old Story, and you'll see why, I hope. So what I wanted to say in the context of how we look at our market and how we look at market information, particularly, that at this time of year, we do get ourselves into a little bit of a loop or a vacuum loop. A vacuum loop, there's nothing in it, and it keeps going round and round. And that's driven by poor or distorted market information, especially by the lack of official crop forecasts. We saw some crop forecasts at the World Cashew Conference last week, but some major countries weren't really in a position to give us any forecasts at all, which is a pity as we get into the month of March. We're also seeing, again, unclear or late policy and regulation announcements. Business people often don't know where they stand. And that's, a whole range of reasons. It's because policy hasn't been announced, regulations for the season haven't been announced, or because they have become volatile and they change far too often to manage the risks inherent in the cashew business. There's a lot of gossip, rumor, myth, and manipulation, mainly because of the previous three factors. Into the vacuum flows rumor, myth, and gossip. And that gives rise to speculation, increases risk, and potentially creates volatility in the market, which in turn leads to poor distorted market information and gets us back to our loop. So what I'm saying is we need to be careful at this time of year who we listen to and how we interpret what we hear. It is, as I would say, a dangerous time of year. Nothing is quite clear. Many things are not what they seem. And the reasons are clear. The market relies on actors for reports for the most part. Reports from brokers, reports from buyers, reports from processors, traders, and so on. This, naturally, as human beings, we tend to talk about what suits us. And when we do that, we distort the market. Social media and all online presence magnifies this out of all proportion. So when we look at the market, we should be thinking about what is the reporter's interest. So in our case, we, insofar as possible, try to remain neutral. We are a little bit pro-Africa, but we don't allow that to distort how we report the market. But when we look at who's reporting, what's their interest? Are they buying or selling? Very simple things. Were they right in what they said to us last year? What about all those myths out there? People are saying a late crop is a small crop. Well, it may be, but not always. Sometimes late crops are big crops. You get better fruit, more nuts, better quality. Late crops in a rainy harvest season are very different to late crops in a dry harvest season. We need to think about some of those myths. We need to think about money. Often, prices move because there's either too much money chasing too many goods, and it may not be moving simply to buy nuts and trade them. It may be moving for other reasons. And on the other hand, there may be a shortage of money. And if there's a shortage of money, that often means that prices can go down. And finally, when we talk to people, we need to think about who's long, who's short, if they're speculating, who's bought and who's not bought. It is natural for people who've bought to talk the market up to confirm their decision. For people who haven't bought, to talk the market down to help the pricing. They may not be trying to manipulate the market, it's just the way our minds work. So we need to be careful. It is a dangerous time of year. Be careful who we listen to. Be careful also what we say, because we should remember that what we say has consequences and may distort the market in the future. And some of those consequences may be unintended. Let's get into some market talk, and we'll have a look at the market. I thought we'd have a look at 2024, and I just wanted to remind ourselves that when we started the GME last year, people were talking about a crop worldwide that was 30 to 40% down. But in reality, when we look at the 2024 crop, it was probably about 3% down. That's my calculation. Other people are saying a little bit less. One or two people saying a little bit more. No one is saying it was 20 to 40% down. But they were saying that 12 months ago. Look at demand in 2024, and it was a really fantastic year for demand worldwide. A record year, in fact, a record year for kernels imports and for kernels consumption. And when we look at it, just looking at those big markets, US imports up 23%. We're going to come back to that. European imports 11%. China still growing quickly, up 12%. Consumption in India up. And if we average all of that out, and these are provisional figures, 2024 isn't that long gone. And statistically, it's only like yesterday. World production, world consumption and demand was probably up around 9%. Now, that's using imports as the calculation number. So it's important. All imports may not be consumed. So we still have that mix to sort out as the year goes on. So when we look at that situation on production and demand, and we look at how that has expressed itself in the balance of supply and demand, I just put this chart together just to look at the blue, which is production, and the red, which is consumption, calculated over recent years. And as you can see, Since 2021, when Cambodia came online as a major producer, we've been in a surplus situation. That surplus was reduced and eroded in 2024 by a smaller crop and by increased demand. So when we look at the situation, what we've seen is that the carry out from year to year has fallen, and demand and supply are much more closely matched in 2024 than they have been in any of the previous 3 years. So we've gone from a production surge through COVID, creating carry-out stocks, slowing demand in 2022 on the economies in the consuming countries, falling prices, unsustainably low prices in 2022 and 2023, strong demand growth, then a lower crop in 2024, price recovers, and now we finish 2024 into 2025 with the strongest demand trend and the lowest carry-in stocks since 2019. That sets the scene for the year ahead. What's different? If we look at 2024, what's different this year? So let's just recap on 2024. We came in with a high carry-in stock, mostly in raw cashew nuts, historically low prices, 15-year low prices, good forward cover amongst kernel buyers. Good forward cover means risk as well as cover, depending on who you've bought from and depending on the volatility of the market. There was talk of very poor crops and slow arrivals. That's this time last year. RCN prices did not match kernels prices, as we know. There was uncertainty regarding regulation in African countries, particularly in relation to export. At that point in the year, we wondered, would the Benin export ban work? We wondered, would there be any changes in other countries? It was a market looking for a reason, looking for a catalyst to go up from historically low prices with a lot of talk about the crop and regulatory uncertainty. Let's go 12 months forward and look at March 2025. So where are we now? Well, we got a lower carry-in stock of raw cashew nuts. It was boosted by really good crops in East Africa. We've got kernels prices at the 10-year average. Interestingly, when you look at it, compared to last year, yeah, for certain it's gone up a long way. But when you look at it historically, it's in or around about the 10-year average. This price should be workable for just about everyone in the chain. We certainly have more kernels inventory at destination due to high imports last year, particularly if we look at the US and to a lesser extent Europe, but primarily in the US, we've probably got a higher kernels inventory. And because of high prices, we've got less forward cover. Buyers have been thinking about buying, they've been thinking about acting. They have been more active in the last 10 days, but still they would have less forward cover than they normally would at this time of year. There is talk of delayed crops, but in contrast to last year, the arrivals are pretty good. Quality is very good in many areas. But still, raw cashew nut prices do not match kernels. Now, what happened last year was that kernels prices rose. Maybe it'll be the opposite this year, where RCN prices will come to meet the kernels levels. In terms of policy, and this is a big factor, we've got a reaction to last year's uncertainty, particularly ad hoc export suspensions or bans. And I think we've probably got a lower likelihood of unpredictable actions this year. I think that regulators and policymakers accept that they need to signal and communicate a little bit better. In essence, we've got a market that's looking for direction. And you can today, if you want, you can get any kind of story about where the market will go. People will tell you it'll go up, it'll go down, it'll go sideways. RCN will go up, kernels will go up, or they won't. So it is a market at the moment looking for direction. Who will move first? So let's look at some of the fundamentals, and we'll start by looking at the harvest outlook. There's a nice picture of some cashews on trees in Cambodia a couple of weeks ago, taken by Mr. Keith Pengun, a consultant and cashew farmer in Cambodia. Looking good. We've been looking at estimates of the crop, and if you've been with us before, you'll know what I do is I tend to kind of make a low estimate, worst case call it, and an optimistic estimate, and you can see it here. So the low estimate is similar to the 2023 crop, a good crop, not quite 2023, but getting up there. The high estimate, and that would be taking optimistic on all countries, puts us way up there into a record crop. Now, that's a big number. 5.8 million tons is a huge number, of course, but I have seen other estimates around 5.6. Where do we get to on that? Well, what I'm saying is that I think, on what we know, Côte d'Ivoire is about the same as 2023. It's a good crop. What's different is the quality. What's coming in so far is really good. That Cambodia will increase in line with the area. The area in Cambodia is going to increase. The productive area, I'm not saying more trees planted. What I'm saying is those that are already planted start to come. India, back to a good crop in India. I'm drawing on presentations from the All India Cashew Association over the last couple of weeks, and we're looking at a crop same as 2023, 775, 800,000 tons. That's pretty good crop. Vietnam, not so good news from what we understand. Maybe a low crop again, about the same as last year. And Tanzania and Mozambique at the end of 2025, hoping that we will see continued growth in those countries and about the same as last year. If we put all that together, we get a very big crop. So let's have a look at some of the countries. Côte d'Ivoire, you don't need to be told that Côte d'Ivoire is #1 cashew producer in the world. It's been growing at about 5.5% up to 2024 over the past 10 years. There's not really any reason to think that'll stop. I calculated last year's crop at about 1.2 million tons. That might surprise you, but look at the disappearance on the crop. If we look at imports into Vietnam, imports to India, processing, according to CCI, and you can approximate that figure pretty easy if you look at the Kernels trade, and then land border trade. So I've taken about 95,000 tons, mainly into Ghana, for export from there. Some people say that's 200,000 tons, which would make the crop bigger. But what we are seeing in Côte d'Ivoire is a slowing growth trend, because what happens eventually is that some of the trees start to age, some of the area goes down. Now there is another interesting point here. If we look at the quality, and quality is excellent this year. Several processors have told me that, one or two traders have also told me that. If, for example, you got an average quality up around 50 pounds, which is what's been coming in, unlikely to be maintained for the whole crop, but that adds 8% in outturn. So you get a double effect. If you get more nuts and higher quality, you get the double effect on production. Farm gate prices have been steady. They are above the minimum farm gate price at the moment. People are looking, we think they're looking to buy at slightly higher prices than the minimum, simply to get hold of the good quality, in the belief that quality will deteriorate as the year goes on, and that would be the history. We had rains in February to help the crop, and export of RCN is scheduled to start around about March 15th, maybe it's March 18th, and there's some discussion around that date at the moment. Border controls have been tightened, so the movement of trucks across the border, which is illegal from the Ivorian point of view, has been, if not halted, severely restricted. Perhaps the movement of motorbikes and boats and small lots is much more difficult to control, but for now it would appear that there's a pretty strong job in controlling the border trade. Optimism in Côte d'Ivoire on what we know so far. Let's have a look in Cambodia. So Cambodia is much more about just a normal progression. So we did a quite an extensive analysis of Cambodia on behalf of the EU German CapSave program in the last quarter of 2024. We reckon about 9% of the trees have still to come to production. Those are trees that were planted in recent years. It has not been affected by the rains that impacted Vietnam. We have seen hot days and cool nights, and we have to remember that last year, when 840,000 tons approximately was produced, yields were lower than expected. So we're forecasting an increase in production in Cambodia this year on what we know today. I don't think that growth will continue at the same pace. Remember that growth in Cambodia over the period of recent years has been 23% per annum. That cannot be continued. That's going to drop right back, but it is still going to grow. And we think it's going to hit 1 million tons sometime around about 2028, 2029, not taking into effect any annual weather conditions. So it looks good in Cambodia. Most of the Cambodian raw cashew nuts, about 96%, goes to Vietnam for processing. So in terms of global production, let's have a quick spin around the globe and look at some of the factors. In Vietnam, we hear of rain damage. The crop may be a little bit like 2024, not a great crop. In India, as I mentioned, All India Cashew Association talking about a pretty good crop, up there with the best Indian crops. We have heard in recent days some areas reporting weather problems. There's also moves to look for support for farmers. It's difficult, as I said, to work out how real the problems are. But All India Cashew Association, 775 to 800,000 tons, compared to something like 625,000 tons last year. In Mozambique, the Nuts Institute in Mozambique, IAM, report a crop of up by 30% on the previous year, around about 186,000 tons, already just under 70,000 tons exported. That is a really good crop. There are always discussions around the actual crop in Mozambique, but one thing I think we can say for pretty much for certain is it's an excellent crop. Tanzania, well, we were working off about 450,000 tons, but the Cashew Board at the World Cashew Conference informed us that the crop was more than 500,000 tons. That is pretty remarkable, and that trend appears likely to continue in Tanzania in the coming years. Nigeria, not a great deal of bad news, no adverse reports at all, and there are efforts to regulate the crop. Looks good, no problems reported. In Benin, well, a range of estimates, but they're all pretty positive. Now, these are big numbers. I've heard an estimate from a government body of 203,000 tons. I've heard an estimate from a leading processor, 240,000 tons. The export ban remains in place. We hear some border trade, illegal border trade, has been going on. Shipments cross borders even at this early stage. The farm gate price is quite low given the quality in Benin, and it is quite likely that there will be pressure to move product across the border, but it's based in the overall goal of increasing processing and feeding the new processing plants in the country. In Ghana, farm gate prices, and this is, earlier we talked about money and money chasing product, and where there's too much money, there's too high prices. Well, I think Ghana might be an example of that. Prices went way up there early on, 23 cedis a kilo, and it's headed back down again, back towards the minimum or the recommended price of 15 cedis per kilo. So that appears to indicate a decent crop, appears to indicate that the market has kind of come to its senses at this point. In Guinea, again, the Guinea Cashew Board informed us of a crop of 200,000 tons, just over 200,000 tons, excellent growing conditions. Again, one or two people asked me, did I think 200,000 tons was a real number? I was surprised. It could, of course, be true. I don't know more than the Guinea Cashew Board. It's a big number, it's a big crop. Burkina, well, again, there's a bit of a conflict between some of the estimates. An estimate of 195,000 tons was floated at the World Cashew Conference. I can't figure that one out myself. We see exports 109 or 110,000 tons. We see processing maybe 15 to 20,000 tons. I think the crop 130,000 tons, but it looks like it's again a good crop. And in Sagabi, we see good reports from our colleagues at Comafrique at the World Cashew Conference and from the Lift Cashew Project. All good, all positive. So as we look around the world, apart from Vietnam, and Vietnam produces about 7% of the world's cashews, we're not seeing bad news on production. This looks like a good crop. On what we know today, things can change, particularly in India. It can change because that crop is a little bit later these days. You could get disruption in Côte d'Ivoire. It's all possible, but it looks good on what we know today. So if we look at the production outlook, we see favorable weather, generally speaking, a few isolated problems, Vietnam being a case in point, increasing production in Cambodia, improved quality and good volumes arriving in West Africa. In India, all the early indicators are good. Give it another 30 days and we'll have a much better idea on that, but looks good. It seems to me that worst case for 2025 is similar crop to 2023. It could be 10% higher than that, all going well. Now, all going well is a big statement because all rarely goes well, but most things may, and we could see a record crop this year. Does that mean prices will go down? Not necessarily. We can't just go big crops, low prices. There's an old saying in commodity trading, big crop, big prices, and sometimes it has a perverse logic. Let's have a look at demand and consumption. And I wanted to remind ourselves, again, thinking, big picture market information, let's just remind ourselves where cashews are consumed. And the big four markets, North America, Europe, particularly India, and China, account for 84% of the consumption of cashew kernels, especially India. The key market is India. It always is. Now, differences in the markets. Three of those markets, China, Europe, North America, do not grow cashews. India does. But Indian cashew production is not growing as fast as India's demand is growing. And therefore, imports are tending upwards, imports of raw cashew nuts, that is. So Indian demand is expressed as demand for raw cashew nuts. The other three major markets by kernels. And if we look at let's have a look at some of the major trade channels. So I just had a look at world trade channels in cashew kernels. And the ones really to focus on, because this is where prices are made, this is where markets are made. The Vietnam to North America channel, about 24% of world trade. Vietnam has 89% share of that in 2024. If we look at the European Vietnam trade, it says 74% there. I actually recalculated that yesterday. It's fallen, it's about 71%, but that accounts for 18% of world trade. And the fast growing channel, Vietnam into China, where Vietnam has a big share. And we have to be careful with this, because if you look at official import figures, they will not reflect this. This is because so much of the trade is land border trade, and that needs to be borne in mind. And someday we'll talk about that with perhaps we'll get some guests from Vietnam and we'll chat about that. But these are the big channels, and this is where prices are made. Africa, let's look at Africa. Africa to Europe is about 4% of the world trade. In 2023, Africa had 17% share. I got the numbers for 2024 yesterday, and it's up to 20%. So that's really positive. So when we look at demand, are we looking at a new era? And I'm focusing on sustainability a little bit here, or are we just looking at a new slogan? So we've big questions for this year. How will demand and consumption react to the higher prices? Now, in some markets, we may already have seen that reaction, and I'm going to look at that in a moment. India. You can't but come away from India being excited about the future for the nuts and dried fruit business in the country. Demand is strong, product ranges are remarkable, product presentation, packaging, product marketing channels are incredibly dynamic. So you have the traditional on the one side, and you have the new channels, new products, new packaging, new presentation. And the question I came away from India 2 weeks ago asking myself was, is there a new surge on the horizon, a new surge in demand? And I'm tempted to say there is. When it happens, not quite sure, but I think it's bubbling under, so to speak. Third question, and we're thinking about Western markets. We talk a lot about sustainability. Big question for me this year is sustainability, and I mean that in the sense of social, environmental, economic sustainability for processors in developing countries. Is it just a brand for the buyers of cashew kernels in the West, something to be used, exploited, or is it part of their identity? Are we seeing real change, or are we simply seeing a new aspect for branding and sales to focus on consumer trends? That's a question that is being answered. And I'll come back to that one a little bit later as well. But first I want to look at how do all these factors react? How does demand come together in the cashew sector? What are the things we need to look at? What are the distortions? Raw cashew nuts supplied, that's production, that's the carrying stock. The processing capacity. So we need to look at processing capacity. How many nuts can be processed in a given place over a given period of time? But we also need to look at the viability of that processing. Is it profitable? Is it sustainable? Is it propped up by supports that won't last forever? Can it stand on its own 2 feet? How likely is there to be a change in processing capacity? If we look at India as an example, processing capacity is likely to grow as mechanized units come on stream. How will that impact other units? Will there be a surplus processing capacity in India? Will that have a downward force on kernels prices in the country? Consumer trends, the raw cashew nut trade. So the trade is different to the supply. The trade is a different business culture. It's volatile. It's not an easy one. It can be very profitable, but it can also be highly loss-making. If we look at kernels, forward contracts, how many forward contracts have been made? How many people are covered? What price are they covered at? How reliable are those contracts? Do they trust them? How will they manage if prices go up? Will they need to rebuy? Will they need to renegotiate? How many of them will actually do the same thing if prices go down? And that's happened in the past too. Buyers renegotiate as well as processors. And finally, the kernel's price volatilities. When we look at all these factors, it's complex. Demand is not just about low price, high demand, or vice versa. So we need to look at the developments in Africa on processing, the transition in India, ongoing, slow process of transition, the mismatch on raw cashew nut prices. Consumer trends, you know about these: snacking, convenience, sustainability, conscience-driven consumption. The RCN chain, we need to ask about this chain. I mean, it's being increasingly regulated, mostly at origin. There's lack of linkages. So if you buy from a trader, you have a different business than if you buy from a farmer or a co-op. If you have your own sourcing operation in the country, your experience of the raw cashew nut market is very different to someone who's a cost and freight buyer just buying at the time of shipment. We need to think about volatility. Volatility of kernels prices is, generally speaking, a destructive force for demand. It slows growth, but what we are seeing now, and increasingly so, is the power of the retailer. Retailers are used to getting their own way in Western countries. Refusal to buy normally leads to matching on price. That may not be the case in the cashew sector. So when we think about the power of the retailer, we also need to, particularly in the context of European or American supermarkets, we need to be thinking about what has that impact on prices? Is it actually increasing volatility? How reliable is the pricing, and how sustainable is this sector that we're working on? And when we look at forward contracting, related to that, of course, is the impact of a time lag due to forward contracting. I've mentioned contract fidelity, i.e. defaults of contract. The transfer of risk. So in forward contracting, the risk is transferred from the supplier to the supermarket. So it might be a roaster, might even be a supermarket, to either to an importer or to a processor exporter. And what does that transfer of risk involve? And as it's transferred, does it make the system less stable and potentially more volatile? So a lot of factors we need to look at. Let's have a look at some of those in relation to specific markets. And we'll start with India. So you can see with India on this chart, so Indian production year by year, orange bars, you can see it's not going far, it varies year to year, smaller crop in 2025. And imports have been a little bit volatile, but generally speaking, a strong upward trend on imports. 2022 probably imported too much and there was a carry in. And that's about worked out now, that's gone. So India is the largest consumer, world ranked number one. It's been growing at about 5% in the 5 years up to 2023. India is the largest consumer. It's the key market for growth in world consumption. It imports 60% of its RCN. And now India is changing a little bit, has been changing for some time. Factors of convenience, value, online sales are really starting to impact on the market, and the perception of cashews as a high-priced, unaffordable product is beginning to be addressed. There still is a relatively low penetration of these products to the total population. India is a very big country, as you know, but still cashews don't reach as many Indians as we would hope they might. If they do, or should I say when they do, we could see a real explosion in consumer demand for tree nuts. And that's going to be complicated by international trade restrictions this year. India seems to have set out an agenda with the United States, and India is a big importer of US almonds, for example. So I think India is looking really positive. Let's have a look at the US market. This year, or 2024 rather, we have seen a record increase in imports, 23%. And what you note from the chart, so we have the total imports in blue, and you can see that that's been moving up. 2021 was a COVID year, big demand spike. 2022 in the second half especially, economic impact. 2023 not so good, and 2024, well, this massive increase, new record in fact. And that's two things. One is the import of natural cashew kernels, HS code 080132, and the other is a continued increase, it's about 45,000 tons now, I believe, of processed nuts, mainly from Vietnam. So this 23% is remarkable because the 10-year growth rate is just under 3%. So how do you go from a growth rate of 3% to a growth rate in a single year of 23%? That is pretty amazing. You can see that processed imports, now bear in mind processed imports are much lower than natural kernels imports, but they're growing at 13% per annum, fast growth. These are mostly bulk packed, roasted, ready to go cashew kernels. So retail sales grew at about 7%. So now we got another figure in there. We need to reconcile 7% retail sales growth with 23% growth in imports. That looks to me that there may have been a building of an inventory in the US in 2024. And it would make sense, because if you've got rapidly rising prices, that's the first factor. You can get some material into the warehouse. You bear in mind, we were at the bottom around about $2.40 FOB for 320s. And the market today, let's call it 335, on average around the world, higher in some places. If we look at that, well, for the difference in that price, you can carry those nuts for some time and still make money out of them. The other aspect was large-scale contract defaults related to the RCN restrictions. So you get those defaults, people need to be defensive on the one hand, so they import as much as they can a little bit earlier, but on the other hand, they're also negotiated or pushed into a situation where they have to buy additional contracts in order to get their low price contracts. And for the most part, that's worked out because the market has stayed relatively stable. So we've got these three factors. We have strong retail sales growth, and that is strong. 7% is really strong. That doesn't cover the entire consumption, but it covers a large proportion of it. Looks like there's some inventory building and growth in processed imports. Relate that back to prices at the retail level. So the lower prices were generally speaking not passed on in 2022 and 2023 to consumers. They weren't passed on because there was uncertainty. There were other costs going up, the cost of oil, the cost of transport, the cost of labor. All these things were going up. Supermarkets didn't pass on those price drops, but they are beginning to pass on some of the price rises now in 2025. What will the impact of that be on US imports this year? Questions about the US, generally positive though. Similarly in Europe. So European imports have moved up by 11%. And what's interesting is, well, and you can see that European imports have been going up pretty strongly over the years. A couple of interruptions. 2018 related, I guess, to the very high prices in 2016 and 2017. Remind ourselves, 320s were above $5 at one point. And again in 2022, when the economic conditions in the second half of the year following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we had a slip back, we had inflation, we had economic uncertainty, and sales dropped back a little bit. When we look at the sources of supply, I suppose the main factor is to note that Vietnam, 72% dominates. Vietnam's actual quantity up by about 10,000 tons. But the news really is that Africa's share, and I've just taken all Africa here, we can go into detailed countries another time, at about 20%. That is a record. And Africa's share is growing over the last 5 years at an average of 28% per annum. So we are seeing the impact of African cashew processing, especially West African cashew processing, in the European market. So this may mean that European buyers are serious about sustainability and that they are prepared to pay more for closer, more sustainable sources. Time will tell. So in Europe, we see steady growth over 10 years and a growth spurt in 2024. Africa's share is up from 17 to 20%. Brazil especially, but that was due to a low crop. Vietnam and India, even though they increased their trade by volume, they did lose a little bit of market share, and that was lost to African countries. Generally speaking, the higher prices have not yet been passed on to European consumers. So again, we might see an impact, and let's have a look at that. So I took some figures, I'm sure he won't mind, from Wim Schipper of Intersnack, made a really interesting presentation at the World Cashew Conference, and I just took some of his numbers and had a look at them. And what we see is European retail sales volume up 9.8%. So that pretty much matches the increase in imports. So we're not expecting on that basis that there would be a large inventory of kernels knocking around in Europe, and the FOT market in Rotterdam would tend to confirm that. Retail prices dropped. Retail prices were 1.4% lower according to the statistics. These statistics are based on 17 European countries. We see strong growth in Eastern Europe. Wim highlighted Poland in his presentation. And we also see strong growth in Southern Europe. But a reduction in what would be the traditional drivers of European consumption. Reduction in volume, not in value, interestingly. People spent about the same amount, maybe a little more, but they got less for their money. A reduction in Germany, the biggest market, Netherlands, a large market, smaller country, but a large market and major through point for kernels into Europe, and Belgium. So those three countries, Northern European countries, showing a little bit of a reduction, not necessarily based yet on prices. That can be based on economic conditions, and we know that many European countries are struggling. The European Union as a whole is struggling economically just at the moment. And so to the most dynamic market, China. And we have to wonder if, because the way China buys, so whereas Europe and the United States tends to buy far forward, or as far forward as they can, China doesn't do that. China buys much closer in. And traditionally, China was a market driven by festivals, but that is beginning to disappear, and that's beginning to even out, which is quite interesting. So we see periods of high prices causing demand to drop away a little bit in China. And we see periods of low prices increasing demand. And in the last 2 years, we've seen strong growth. Now, these figures are driven by Vietnam's export figures as well as exports from other countries. So China seems to be a price sensitive market, and it does look that in the second half of last year, we saw a reaction. So I looked at the first half of 2024 versus the first half of 2023 and found trade up 63%. But in the second half, so second half 2024 versus second half 2023, that trade was down 17%. What changed? Prices changed. So this would appear to be a price sensitive market. But it is growing. It's 95% a snack nut market. If this Chinese market continued to grow as it has been growing, it'll be bigger than the US market by 2030. That's pretty remarkable if it continues, but the question mark is, what will higher prices do? There is a potential impact, maybe positive on cashews, if there was tariffs on tree nuts from the United States. So when we look at the Chinese market, we saw very interesting commentary from Madam Chen Ying of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce for the import and export of foodstuffs and native produce at the World Cashew Conference. And she said, the nut industry in China is showing a booming trend in China in the future.
Oh, really?
So this we are looking at as a highly positive trend for tree nuts. So let's think about, how do higher prices tend to impact demand in these three big markets? So in this chart, what you can see is the annual price average, that's the dotted line, and there's the scale on the left, versus the change in demand. So the growth or fall in demand in North America, the red bars, and in Europe, the blue bars. Basically, if it's above the line, it's good news. If it's below the line, it's not. So generally what we see is that, yeah, higher prices, here's 2016-17, slowed growth. Probably more in the US than in Europe, but nonetheless, The US market contracted in 2016 and grew slowly in subsequent years based on the impact of higher prices. The European market, steady growth throughout, but again, it's much slower growth during periods of high prices. So high prices do affect demand. There's no doubt, but it has continued growth. Even through periods of high prices, there has been growth. If we look at the two big negative points, they're both more influenced by economic conditions than by high prices. So the end of the financial crisis, 2010, 2011, and 2022, I mentioned already the economic difficulties of that year in rising inflation following the invasion of Ukraine. So what we can say is, whereas it's likely that demand growth will slow down in 2025, it certainly doesn't look, based on any trend we've seen in the past, that it will be halted, devastated, or that there will be a major contraction in demand based on the current level of prices. What we can say is that if we look at this period, 2012 through to 2015, when there was price stability, that we did see strong growth. So we can say that price stability has been good for demand. So if I was looking at this and I was saying, what's the best thing for demand in 2025? I would say stable prices, number one, and stable prices in or around about the current levels, if those can be sustained by the supply and demand balance. Quick look at China then, and first thing we see, very volatile situation. So again, the red bars are the growth or fall in demand in China in any given year. The lines are the high-low average prices for the year. And again, we see in times of low or stable prices, really strong growth. 2019, 2023, but China is also impacted by economic conditions, 2022, 2011. So we need to look at the state of the economy in China to give us a guideline. But right now, I think we can say probably China is more price sensitive than Western markets. The United States is more price sensitive than the European market. But in all three, we are likely to see some impact of price volatility. So demand and consumption outlook, strong underlying trends in consumer demand. They've been there for a long time. There's no sign of that changing. Markets like China, as I mentioned, and India have already felt the impact of higher prices. That's because forward buying reaction to price changes is much quicker in those markets than it is in Western markets, where, because of the nature of so-called modern retail, supermarkets, forward contracting and tenders, price impact takes a lot longer, maybe 6 months to a year, in some cases even longer than that. It depends on when the market moves up. Inventories may be higher, and I'm talking kernels inventories may be higher in some markets than in previous years, especially the United States. That might slow buying, but shouldn't have an impact on demand overall. And to balance it, I'm thinking that forward contracting is a little bit less than it would have been in a typical situation, simply because many buyers will have been anticipating lower prices. They haven't really got them. Maybe it's about, what would you say, 10 cents down, I think, on the year so far for kernels. Doesn't look particularly weak. People talk about lower prices, but they can't really look at lower prices on kernels until they see more competitive prices on raw cashew nuts. So my conclusion would be that demand will not collapse this year, but growth rates for cashew kernel demand will slow down. So this means that we will end up again in a surplus position, all going well on the harvests, but the time for demand to catch up with supply, which I would have said was 2028, now might be a year or two later than that. We're not going to see the market go into deficit anytime soon. There's a strong argument here for building long-term demand, perhaps generic promotion of cashews, in order to allow the growth in demand to catch up with the growth in supply. So some of our questions, the last section is outliers and big questions for 2025. So I'm thinking, first of all, policymakers. Policymakers made the headlines last year. What will happen in the coming look at the estimates, around 200,000 tonnes or more. Processing. So people saying about 120,000 tonnes can be processed in Benin this year. That's a big ask. You know, it's a big ask to go from 50 odd to 120 in a season. There are established factories, of course, but the new factories, this is a big ask. It's a big ask when you've got a surplus, because whatever way you look at it, the country does not have the capacity to process its entire crop this year. Let's hope they maximize the processing, but whatever way you look at it, they're not going to process the entire crop if these estimates are correct. That is a concern, and the cross-border trade is therefore likely to continue. How that's managed is expended to control the borders. It's a really big question. Côte d'Ivoire, also a highly managed country. There is a question now beginning to arise, could the processor buying window be extended? And this is not official. This is processors asking this. Is it necessary? I doubt it. But it could happen to facilitate some processors who need more time. That would disrupt export of raw cashew nuts. I think buyers have maybe made already some provisions, and they have started their activities elsewhere first in anticipation of the possibility of further restrictions. I think we also have to be a little bit sympathetic towards the position in Côte d'Ivoire. The main drive is toward processing. The regulatory body, the CCI, is not necessarily the decision maker on this. There is a question. I mean, even if we look at last year, processing spiked up really well last year. 344,000 tonnes is the estimate officially. If you look at the trade, it's probably not far wrong. But a lot of processors still struggled, and the ban didn't really help those individual companies. It didn't drop farm gate prices. It didn't create more finance in the system. The opportunity to buy from exporters who had already been sourcing didn't really arise. So, you know, there's a lot of politics mixed up in any country in regulation. And this, whereas I would say that the regulatory body recognizes the need for good market organization, I would also say that maybe they're not always the decision maker on this, so we have to keep a close eye, and we'll know in the next 2 weeks. Question mark on Burkina. Burkina and Mali now have left the ECOWAS. The Burkina government has introduced restrictions on the export of some food products, not specifically cashews. Will there be any disruption to the supply chain from Burkina through Ghana for export in the Ghanaian ports? This is an important trade. Obviously, Burkina is a landlocked country, and product has to flow. Similarly for Mali. Guinea-Bissau system seemed to work last year, but it was a much smaller crop than normal last year. The new system encouraged people to work through the port of Bissau, which is not an easy port, as anyone who's ever traded there will know. If there's a good crop, and that's what's being forecast, will that mean that there will be still a flow of product into Senegal or the Gambia or into Guinea for export? So you would expect government, having introduced a successful system, to strengthen it. If they're successful in doing that, it may actually lead to a slowdown in exports of a good crop. So that's something that needs to be watched carefully. These restrictions, the ban in Benin, potentially an extended processor buying window in Cote d'Ivoire, and I only say potentially, I want to underline that. I won't be undermining it, I'll be underlining it. And Guinea-Bissau, all of those things would have a negative impact on farm gate prices. Any restriction to the flow of product is likely to negate farm gate prices. Any ban is likely to restrict the flow of money. Anything that restricts the flow of money negatively impacts farm gate prices. And finally, looking forward toward the last quarter of the year, will the regulators in Tanzania address these issues that are causing problems for processors? Levying of local taxation, which shouldn't happen according to the law, the payment through the cooperative unions as opposed to the local co-ops, the AMCOs, is all causing difficulties to processors. They are there because they can buy directly high quality cashews from farmers. If the crop is 500,000 tonnes, why not do something to encourage processing more? And we hope they will do that. So there could be disruption from regulation and policymakers. This is a volatile environment. We have seen in the past surprising decisions. We've seen in the past poor communication around those decisions. Traders, processors, customers would like to know what's going to happen before it happens. They'd like to know how long it's going to last, and they'd like to know how that can be managed. Second question is around Burma kernels. Will this trade continue to grow? So Vinacast tells us that Vietnam imported 130,000 tonnes of Burma kernels in 2024. Burma kernels are partially processed, shelled but unpeeled cashew kernels. They can be exported, sometimes popular in China, increasing popularity in other markets, but also they're peeled and processed in the normal way. This trade means that Vietnam is Africa's largest customer for kernels, as well as for RCN. And now when we talk about regulation, we start to wonder, how dependent is African processing becoming on its competitor in Vietnam? So will the trade in Burma kernels stunt the growth of African processing, either by making it a partial process or by making it simply a mechanized process with very few jobs, shelling, separating, and managing the byproducts only? That changes the dynamic. I mean, that changes the entire objective, entire structure. It undermines the sustainability of African processing. It undermines the whole idea of a sustainable sector in West Africa, particularly adjacent to markets in Europe and the US, or in East Africa, servicing markets in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. But it's not only in Africa where it has an impact. The Burma kernels trade could have a huge impact on smaller factories in Vietnam. Other question, I haven't asked it here, but another question comes to mind: will there be a Burma kernels trade in Cambodia? Will Cambodia allow the similar situation to develop, where processing becomes a partial process? Now you might say, well, Burma kernels trade, at least you're not moving 4 odd tons of raw cashew nuts for every ton of kernels you produce, and that's true. But you are sacrificing traceability, you are increasing food safety risk, you are undermining the sustainability of the sector. It's not origin processing, it's a version of origin processing. This is important, and it brings me to the question, are we as a sector aligned with the drivers of consumer demand? And this is going to be a big factor this year. Now we are seeing plenty of buyers, they're mostly Europeans as it happens, looking to develop better supply chains, and they're looking in all origins to do that, and they're looking for quality, they're looking for shorter supply chains, traceability and transparency, and now increasingly labour and environmental compliance. Europeans need to do this because it's becoming the law. They are now responsible for their supply chains. There is no deniability anymore, or at least from 2028. Are we aligned with servicing that? And I think in many ways we're not. We've got long supply chain, variable quality, lack of traceability, lack of transparency. Look at the market information discussion 40 minutes ago. And we have very variable levels of labour and environmental compliance. This is a question. This is not about just making a sale. This is a systemic threat. If the sector, if the chain is not aligned with the drivers of consumer demand, they'll stop buying. Nobody needs cashews. Everybody wants them. Nobody needs them. Question 4, is sustainability just a label for African processors? And I think this is an important question. So this sustainability tree, this is something I think I showed you last year when we were talking about these factors. And I was arguing that African processing is highly sustainable. In fact, I was arguing that origin-based processing, whether it's in Vietnam or Cambodia, whether it's in India or in African countries, is sustainable. But my question now is, has it become just a label? When we talk about responsibility in the supply chain, when we talk about location, when we talk about traceability, transparency, managing climate change, social justice, are African processors, many of them new investors, of course, are they just paying lip service to these things? Or is it part of their identity? And that's a really important question during 2025. How can the chain be made more fit for purpose? Well, this is related to the last 2 or even 3 questions. Greater integration of the farmer and the processor, the supply chain. So whether it's a local processor or whether it's a distant processor, integrating into the supply chain makes sense. If you want to buy West African raw cashew nuts, ideally buy them from farmers, whether you're in India, Vietnam, or wherever you are. It should be the same. Buy from farmers, buy from co-ops, buy from local organizations that can work with you. You may find that international traders help to facilitate that. That works too, but it needs to be done. The old-fashioned commodity trade doesn't work in the modern environment. Second factor is lower processing costs. So when we look at processors, and mostly I'm talking about African companies now, processing costs remain too high. And these are down to management, infrastructure, for example, power, and the quality of raw materials. So this year we are seeing improved quality in many countries in West Africa, but it's not a trend. It is likely to be a single year. In fact, up to this year, what we've seen is lower quality. So are we going to see that back again? We need more innovation too. Businesses need to start thinking about how they package. We saw the big bags processing, packing for processors. Recently again, great idea. It works, it's in demand. But also ideas of secondary processing, roasting, or batch ready kernels that are ready to go into the manufacturing process, that do not need recleaning, that can be used directly in process with confidence. And the last thing I'd say is we do, over the long term, because supply and demand will rebalance, we do need more production, but it should be through higher yields and not more trees. The area suitable in West Africa is going to decline. The area suitable in Cambodia has been mainly planted. The area suitable in East Africa is getting there. So we need higher yields. In West Africa, we're looking at yields as low as 250 kilos per hectare. Now, in some countries, Cote d'Ivoire, maybe it's 400 kilos per hectare. In other countries, it's also better. But compare that to the average in Cambodia, 1.42 tons. And it makes me think that the answer is improved yields, not more trees. The chain needs to adjust to become fit for purpose. Otherwise, we're going to be sitting talking in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, and it'll be wondering what happened to that opportunity. we just went for greenwashing and we ended up with nothing? Are we on whether we have a big crop on our hands or whether there have been some problems? If I'm betting, to be good for the industry. Prices, to me, kernels prices appear to be in a sustainable range. I mean, economically sustainable range. But they might slip back a little bit on some harvest pressure. You may see lower prices, I feel, over the coming weeks, but they may well then recover a little bit towards the end of the year. I don't see at this stage any strong reverse on the overall future of the sector, and particularly on how we might manage market information and how we might be cautious in what we listen to and how seriously we take it in the coming weeks as the crop develops. Thank you very much indeed. Stella, have we any questions?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for today's presentation. Yes, I have a couple of questions, quite a number of them. The first one is from Lucia Sebastio from Mozambique. And here is how our question goes. How will the new US policy impact the cashew kernel imports? Will the increase in tariff to protect domestic US market harm the cashew kernel?
It's great. It's a great question. Thank you for that question. I debated whether or not I would bring this into the discussion today. I think that there are risks here. So there's two aspects to this, I think. On the one side, if we look at countries that have a balance of payments deficit or surplus with the United States, so Vietnam, for example, Vietnam could be a target for US tariffs. Would they affect cashews? Possibly, but there's been no real indication of that. Don't forget, it's a relatively small sector, and tariffs on food may or may not be the case. The other side of it is that there may be increasing retaliation on tariffs from China, from India, potentially from the European Union, and increasing tariffs might well then open the door for cashew kernels to be more competitive in the market. So it could be good news. I don't see any likelihood of import tariffs on cashew kernels from Europe or from India at the current time. And I don't see the possibility of blanket tariffs on nuts imports into the United States. However, it is a very volatile period. As we've seen that there is an inclination to make sweeping decisions without necessarily considering the impact of those decisions. So we do need to watch this space. So I think it could be good on one side by limiting tree nuts, but it could be negative on the other side by perhaps putting tariffs on the import of food products from some countries. And the risk is that there'll be blanket tariffs across a whole range of products impacting cashews. It shouldn't happen, but it could. Stella. You're muted, I think, Stella.
Hi, Jim. The next question goes like this. What, according to you, is a good time for Indian processors to get into contracts from Africa?
Well, it depends on your business. If your warehouse is empty, I'd suggest you get into contracts now. If your warehouse is full, then wait. But I think probably the time is coming. I think that the increase in processing capacity in India is likely to increase demand for raw cashew nuts. That doesn't necessarily mean that consumption will increase, but you could see competition between what we call the modern mechanized processors and traditional processors. So I think that I think it's quite likely that RCN prices will fall. It's much more likely that RCL prices will fall than the price of kernels will rise. So therefore, I'd be taking my time on buying my raw cashew nuts at the moment. But bear in mind that high quality raw cashew nuts are always going to be in demand. And if you wait too long, you may end up buying lower quality material. I do see, just looking at the supplementary questions, I do see RCN prices falling. I don't see the fact that there's greater processing in Africa keeping RCN prices firmer than they would normally be. And I don't see the carry out as having any huge impact now. I think that's already in the market. Stella, back to you.
Another question. With the current mechanization revolution and large-scale
Do
units
you know what?
coming
I've kind of answered that one, Stella, I think.
okay,
I think
so
2 and 3 I kind of addressed in the last
almost
answer.
the same. Yeah. So I would move to the question by Amadou Balde from Senegal. He actually has a concern. It's more of a concern than a question. He says, regarding the volatility and the new situation imposed by the arrival of the new government, which has blocked finances in almost the country, including those in the cashew project in progress, such as Shelter for Life.
Yeah, I mean, that is a concern. If a shortage of funds means lower prices at the farm gate, there's no question about it. I think that basically if finance is tight, if development projects are restricted in their activities, it can only be bad news for the sector. So I too would be concerned about that, and I don't see any change in that in the short term.
The
So,
next question goes by, if Vietnam's raw cashew nut inventory is low and IVC exports start mid-March, April, how will Vietnam source raw cashew nuts until June, July?
well, Vietnam is got an opportunity to buy about 800,000 tons in Cambodia. Vietnam has bought significantly in Tanzania, more significantly than normal, and in Mozambique. And there are alternatives. Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, Burkina. So I think that I don't really see any tightness emerging on the supply of raw cashew nuts. There are lower inventories, but when we say lower inventories, we're not talking about a critical situation. We're talking about a situation which was lower inventories than previous years. So I don't think we're talking about a critical situation. Now we're already into March and people are selling. People are willing to sell and they're looking for buyers. And that would tend to indicate that they're relatively confident on their supply of raw cashew nuts over the next 6 months or so. Stan.
We have another question. With strong Vietnam CK exports and well-filled stocks, will demand be sustained?
Will demand sustain?
Yes.
Well, that's what we've been talking about, and I think demand will grow more slowly, but it will be sustained during this year. The underlying trends in demand are strong enough to indicate that demand will remain relatively strong. The only thing that could really change it would be some form of economic shock or some possible volatility in price. So if for some unforeseen reason prices of cashew kernels jumped up, that would impact demand. If we had some form of economic shock, demand, particularly in the West, would probably get impacted. But I think demand will be sustained throughout the year. Just don't expect the kind of growth we saw last year.
I have exhausted the questions that were brought to us today. Thank you for the first GME of 2025. What would be the outlook for the next session?
I just see another question in there. How have the recent showers in IVC affect the crop development? Generally good news for the crop, those showers. I think that it's going to be, I think it's quite positive for the crop on what we can see right now. And there was another question there I noted about the apples in Cambodia. What do they do with the cashew apple in Cambodia? Same as they do with them everywhere else, very little. Outlook for the next session. Well, next time I'm going to look at processing in African countries. What's been going on, what it means, how it's improved, how it's growing market share. And we're going to look at progress on production. We're going to look at progress on buying. And we might have a little look at historical price levels over the longer period. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today about cashews. Thank you so much for all of the questions. My email address is on the screen. My WhatsApp number is on the screen. If you want to talk cashews at any time, drop me a line. Thanks very much to everyone for attending. Thank you very much to the African Cashew Alliance and its supporters, including the EU and MoveCom Cashew, for supporting this event. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, team. Bye.